Can a fantasy change the structure of your brain? An adolescent neuroscientist talks about Winnie the Pooh. Ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovets. Joining me is Dr. Moriah Thomason from NYU Langone's Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to talk about whimsy and fantasy and how it impacts our brains with a look at Disney's Winnie the Pooh sequel, Christopher Robin.
Hello, Eeyore.
Christopher Robin, it's you played again.
Let's go and see if we can find Piglet.
I've already stayed far too long. Hello, everyone. It's Christopher Robin! So nice to see you all again.
Why, thank you.
Silly old bear. I was wrong about work. I was wrong about everything, and I've got to get back to my family.
Farewell, Christopher Robin.
Moriah, fantasies like Winnie the Pooh are wonderful entertainment, but as a doctor and a scientist, is it good for children to believe that their toys are alive?
Yeah, I think that they probably should have some fantasy and for them to have a wild imagination, because the job of a child's brain is to be built, right? There's a serious necessity for that brain to grow and to develop. And to do that, the child has to interact with all types and forms of environments. If the environment was particularly prescribed and there was no opportunity for imagination, then the child's world is limited, what the child can experience and feel. And I think that because the job of a brain is to build working models of the world, the brain has to be able to try different things out, has to be nimble, has to be able to adjust.
I like that you're using the words build and be built, as if a child's brain and all of these inputs in it are really changing and growing and is something that can be positively influenced, I think is what's exciting about using the word build instead of grow.
When a brand new baby is born, all that that baby has in terms of interaction with the world comes from the sense organs. So you have what your eyes see, what your ears hear, and all of that is going to reinforce, what are the truths, what are the principles, what are the qualities of life. And so, yeah, I think that we must have a fundamental nature that made it so that you can take these things in, that you can build these models and then begin to interact.
Are children's brains more open to fantasy because they're structurally built that way, or is it just that they're empty of information and so anything comes filling in?
It's definitely that they are built to be wired. In fact, the process of development prenatally is to really just populate that brain with cells. So you see rapid proliferation of cells, and then you see that followed by a lot of connections. So the connectivity of the brain is really the messaging signals of our brain. They're going to initially be programmed to be very promiscuous. So they're going to reach out, they're going to build tons of connections, and then the active processes of reorganization that happen really early in life are sort of a developmental pruning. So say you over-connect, like you're over-promiscuous about making those connections, then those will be refined through the experiences that you have to enforce the circuits that are meant to be there and to literally, like pruning your hedges, trim away the ones that aren't. And that's all based on chemical processes and programming that tells the brain, let's do this, let's keep building this way. And it wouldn't make sense to build a brain that does that throughout the life course, because that would not really serve us. We need to build these systems and then we need to maintain these systems.
So childhood really is structurally precious.
And an active process.
When Christopher Robin leaves the 100-acre woods and never returns, the animals grieve for his loss, but Tigger is still Tigger, and Owl is still Owl. They don't change at all. What about us humans? Does trauma change our brains?
I work with a very high-risk cohort in Detroit, in Michigan, and these are children that not only experience a high proportion of trauma, but I think it's probably also compounded by stress in the environment, uncertainty. There's something very powerful about probability, prediction, regularity in terms of children's routines and them knowing what to expect. That's something that we understand. And so these kiddos, they have sort of a mixture of a lot of things going on. And what we see in them and with performing MRI scans of their brains and looking at brain activity and brain connectivity, also looking at their behavior, is that they do have challenges with attention. They do have maybe there's a potential that they're going to be more vigilant to the noise of the environment and less able to, let's say, tune out when they need to focus to learn, for example, in the classroom. And again, that brings me back to the question of what's adaptive.
Right, they have had to learn to be on watch, and that's what their brains do.
Yeah, so I think it's important that we don't treat children that have experienced trauma as, I don't want to feel sorry for them. I want to kind of celebrate the fact that we are able to adapt, because trauma exists, like it exists no matter what. So if we can kind of look at the power of the ability to respond to it and why it's doing what it does, we can't undo the trauma, but we can appreciate what's happening, and we can try to make sure that the course is good so that they can go to the classroom and they can learn.
I got to back up for just a minute because I'm throwing these terms around like I understand them. What is a neurological change?
When we think about brain and change, we can go all the way down to DNA, because the way that DNA is expressed changes how proteins are synthesized. So we can look at that level. We can go up to at the cellular level and think about receptors on the surface of the cell being up or down regulated. We can go up to the microscale and talk about cells and how they're connected to each other. And then we can take several leaps up to the whole neural systems, how coordinated systems at the whole global brain network communicate with each other differently. You and I have many of the same systems. We have names for them. We have functions that are associated with them. But how much system A and system B are collaborative in my brain might look a little bit different than yours.
Really?
And so we can go all the way from DNA all the way up to systems of the brain and how those systems interact. So changes at all those scales. And if you alter one level, then you probably should think about ripples that would affect the other levels.
The characters in this movie are comfy, cozy, middle-class Londoners. In real life, how does poverty exacerbate all these issues with a child's brain development?
We know that poverty has an impact on the developing brain. In my group and many other groups, we're focused not so much on what is the association between poverty and brain, but what are the explanatory pathways between poverty and brain that potentially we could have a say, we could interfere, we could somehow get in there and improve in order to lead to ultimately the best outcomes. So examples would be children that are in poverty more frequently have less social emotional support. They may have differences in terms of environmental toxicants or chemicals, disrupted sleep patterns, access to resources, nutrition. So you have to come at it both from enrichment. The environment has more enrichment if you have more resources. There's a language divide in the number of words spoken to children that are living in extreme poverty, and those things impact the developing brain, most certainly. And so the approach that I take is, it's not super useful to say, oh, how does poverty affect the brain? What's very useful to say, okay, we get it. Poverty affects the brain, but what is it that we can do that can somehow buffer the effects that we're seeing that leads to eventually a better outcome for that child? And I think that's where we're going to get a lot of traction. So, and another piece of that is that more and more our group in particular is thinking not just about poverty as in the home, but poverty in the neighborhood.
Sure.
Because the current thinking and the approach to thinking about poverty in the brain has tended to be a little bit focused on just the household's resources. But I think there's something really important about the environment. And it goes back to this idea that if we understand the pathways, then we have an opportunity for change.
Christopher Robin and his lovely wife Evelyn have a daughter, Madeline. And in the movie, as is sometimes the tradition in real-life British families, the Robins are preparing to send their daughter away when she turns 12 years old. And in real life, early childhood separations is a huge American issue right now. Where does the issue of early childhood separation fall on the scale of life-altering traumas?
I'm really excited that in the past 5 or so years, there's been a lot of attention to trauma having different forms. So instead of thinking of trauma as a universal challenge, there's been some focus on what aspects of trauma are from sort of things like violence or abuse versus neglect. And the discussion in the scientific community has been, those are very different things. Those have very different roles in terms of affecting a child's development. And we think of the lack of enrichment being a little bit like what you could just speculate is an environment with less engagement, learning. And so where you see differences in the brain that are associated with that form of trauma, because it's a form of trauma, is the short answer.
Sure, absolutely.
Is in cortical development, is in social emotional functioning. It interferes with attachment. And then that's as compared to violence or exposure, threat of physical harm, which is affecting things like learning processes and attention we spoke about earlier. So different type of trauma, different types of effects in the brain. And I'm really glad that that's where the conversation's gone in terms of having opportunity to help these kids.
Can you track backwards from the expressions in the brain to the nature of the trauma?
Not at this point, no. I think there's a movement to decode the brain, right? There's a movement to get to the level where we can understand the processes, but it's going to happen in really basic areas. It's not going to happen in something, it's going to happen like in visual science where you see, a movie on the screen and you can decode the brain signals.
What does that mean, decode the brain?
It actually means literally you can read out like the functions of a brain through an MRI. You can look at, say, the visual cortex, and you can train a decoder to watch a bunch of different humans watch the same movie clip and then have them watch a library of movie clips. And then you can use that information, put a new person in the scanner, show them a completely new clip, a car driving down a highway, different clip, no one saw it before. And the probability that the computer can figure out what they're watching is much, much higher than chance.
And then it's all going to become zeros and ones, and it's going to be fed into a big computer, and we're in sci-fi land.
Yeah, but we haven't gone backwards in time, which I think is what you're asking. So that's a little more sophisticated. Yeah.
We were talking earlier about the nature of a separation trauma. It's a very political issue. What are your thoughts on the children at the border?
Certainly, the children at the border are a major concern and something that a lot of us are focused on, because the experience that those children are having, without a doubt, encompasses all of the things that you and I have been discussing: the lack of probability, the trauma, the separation, and fears of self-harm, which is very much what exposure to violence is. Very much, that's the fundamental fear that you're tapping into. So it's this uncertainty, I think, that they're probably having to endure for really long periods of time, such that even if they're not directly exposed to some horrible violent act, which they may be, still that is going to affect them in ways that are very similar to what we're talking about. So that is a big problem, and I think we're all really concerned about it.
In the movie, Christopher Robin's daughter is eager for his attention, but anyone who's had a kid turned into a teenager knows that does not last. At what point and why does that have to change?
I think that the transition to adolescence is programmed into our very nature. I mean, we have a serious job to do. We have to go from being the child of a house and supported by our parents to being the parent and supporting a house. And that's a significant upturning of roles and responsibilities. And I think that our nature programs us to prioritize things differently, to take signals from the environment and learn in different ways than we did as a child, to look outward. And I think that that's just coincides with this departure from it's not cool to think Frozen's cool anymore.
Yes, in my house, my children were like, "Do not speak to me of Pokemon, mother, for I am 12 years old." Why do they have to give up these fantasies? Why do they have to go?
They're taking one jacket off, right? They're putting on a new jacket. This is a shedding of an identity. And our identity, we're all tied up in our identities. And there's something very real about Pokemon's not cool anymore.
Well, it ties into what you said about the way the brain is built. The brain is built to like Pokemon, and then it has to break with that. There's going to be a violence too big a word, but it has to be an aggressive break. And Pokemon and us as their parents.
We also can't just put this on the brain. We have this social world around us that confirms these steps as being the correct steps. So it's the brain also looking in a mirror of experience that's going to just say, you know, here's what matters now. Here's what matters. We put fluffy toys in our kids' faces when they're little. We're like, hey, this is so cute. Like when they're adolescents, we aren't really expecting those same responses either.
So advice to a parent: if, gosh, we spend so much time when they're little saying, you're going to be safe, it's all right, I'm here, I'm in charge, I'm making decisions, I've got you. How does a parent help them make that split from, get out of my house?
You know, I don't know that I have the right answer because I'm a parent, and I think as a parent you spend a lot of time just wondering. But I do know that it's something that's a conversation, an ongoing conversation in the home, talking about the future. We don't just live in the moment. So in my home, you know, we look at possible futures. We look at what's coming, so that it's an active dialogue. They're still protected. They're still supported, but
you've given
they
them
are aware that there is a point at which they're going to have to notice.
Yeah, you've given them an on-ramp to adulthood, where they can start to see it and start to build it in their brains. That's very interesting. It's always good to have a parent scientist on board. Madeline Robin in this gentle comedy is aggressively discouraged by her father Christopher from indulging in fantasies. To protect and prepare her for adult life, she's given limited emotional autonomy. She doesn't get to think or play or be whimsical, but then Winnie the Pooh and his friends tumble into her life and it all turns out splendidly because it's a movie. What is emotional autonomy and why do kids need it?
You need to be given the opportunity to explore your emotional self, just like you're taught to explore mathematical logic or rules or scientific properties. And we know from research that the helicopter parent doesn't work. That doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? I couldn't tell you exactly what the demonstrated proof is on why not, but my intuition is that we have to get things wrong to get them right. And emotions are one of the trickiest, stickiest things that we as humans have to deal with.
Do these fantasies, do these stories, does the silliness help a child's brain develop?
I think that it must, and I had a conversation with my son about coming on your show, and I asked him what he thought about this idea that the child's mind needs to be full of fantasy and imagination, and he's 9, and quite amazing. He said to me, Mom, of course. He said it as if this isn't even a question. Why would people talk about it? He said, logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. And I thought, wow, that's a great answer. And he's like, yeah, do you know who said that? Albert Einstein. And I was like, well, then we've got it sorted out, because if Albert Einstein thinks we need imagination. Yeah, so I think that we absolutely need it, because we have to be able to be nimble. We have to be able to explore. It's not just a matter of getting from one point to another, to a ready, to what are we trying to get to? A ready to think point? Life is dynamic. What do you need at 30? What do you need at 40? What do you need at 50? What do you need when uncertainty comes into your life and you have to completely write it all over again?
So would you say that the fantasies that we build in childhood build out our brains to be used in our 30s, 40s, and 50s? Is that valid?
I think that's valid. Yeah.
In the original Winnie the Pooh, Christopher Robin famously promises Pooh that he won't ever forget about you even when I'm 100. In this movie, Christopher Robin, as well as in the Mary Poppins sequel, seems to say that adults must remember these childhood whimsies in order to better see the adult world. But those are movies and you're a doctor, so what do you think? Do childhood fantasies impact who we are as adults?
I think that childhood fantasies impact us, and I think that we probably draw on them differently from person to person, from moment to moment. There may be just huge individual difference in our interest in tapping into either the fantasies we had or the experiences we had as children interacting with those fantasies. Because when I think back, I think of myself. I reflect the world through my experience as I felt it. And so maybe there is some value for some people in being able to recall the experiences or the way that they felt when engaging around fantasy.
You know, there's so much nostalgia these days. Do you think we should keep them alive? Keep these fantasies alive for ourselves? Will it help us as adults?
Maybe the happiness associated with the experience of the fantasy. I mean, I know that I have good days and bad days, and stress is a huge part of
Being an adult?
being an adult. And so if you can somehow use it to your advantage, I think that that would be great. Or if it helps you to be more creative or...
That's great advice. In the movie, the grown-up Christopher Robin tells Winnie the Pooh that he is not who he used to be. And Pooh insists, but you are. Are we still who we were as children?
I think so. I think that some of us are more or less in touch with that, and we probably call it as we need it.
Do you think the brain changes enough from childhood to adult that we could call them different brains in the way that we shed our skin? It's a whole new body by a certain time. Does the brain act like that also?
I don't think so. The one caveat that I would provide is that the adult brain is not just a grown-up version of a little brain, because the path that we follow forward through development from getting to an immature brain to a mature brain is nonlinear. So there's not like a direct line, like this structure just gets bigger and they all get bigger at the same time. So there's not a miniature child brain inside of, children are not miniature adults, as it were. However, there is a programming that happens and that we're prepared for our environments. And so it's not that we cast off our earlier experiences. I think those experiences deeply shape who we are, and that is part of who we are as adults. And some people probably don't hold tight to the fantasy and the experiences of their childhood, but some people probably are closely in touch with it.
Well, that leads us to a very interesting question of, are some adults more suited to fantasy than others? And I have to tell you that most of my friends who are artists really want you to say that the artists have a special brain that allows them and insists that they hold on to this whimsy as long as possible. But is there any validity to that?
Okay, no pressure to tell your
No
artist.
pressure.
I'm sure that it's advantageous, but you could make the same argument for engineers who have to think creatively, right? You could think of it for scientists who have to push new frontiers and figure new things out. You could think it even for athletes, because athletes have to not be so caught up in, they have to be more open to ways that they can move their bodies and explore their spaces.
So what they're telling us in the papers all the time about don't grow old, keep moving, keep changing, has significant impact on your work.
Huge. I think above all things, exercise is absolutely critical.
Literally keep moving.
Literally keep moving. Yeah.
And what about learning crossword puzzles and all of that? And
They all help. They all help. Yeah. I think there are some people that ask, is this helping? Is it helping enough? Is this going to keep me from Alzheimer's? And the answer is maybe not. Maybe it's not the thing that's going to have the biggest effect size to lead to the best outcome, but we know they're all working in the right direction.
So do the thing that makes you happy.
Yeah, so if you like doing crossword puzzles, do crossword puzzles. Play brain games online.
Yeah.
If it's all helping you, but also walk and see friends. Social
Sure.
activities also.
In our lifetime, there's been an explosion of entertainment options. If you want, you can enjoy nearly non-stop consumption of fantasy stories. And in video games, you experience the fantasy in the first person, making it even more intense. Moriah, on the other end of the scale, do you think that the constant consumption of fantasies is bad for us? And can it change? And can that consumption of fantasies change our brains too?
Anything in excess is a concern. And one of the things that springs to mind when you ask that question is, could we actually begin thinking differently if fantasies followed some particular line? Like, we've seen a lot of zombie movies in the past couple of years. We've seen lots of post-apocalyptic type of themes. So is it possible that maybe we think more about these topics because they're in our world? I would say it's possible. But I don't think that interacting with video games or the kinds of limited virtual reality that we have accessible to us now, today, is the kind of thing that's going to literally affect how we interact with the environment. Major caveat to that is, I have a cell phone, and you do too. And when I need to go somewhere, I usually just literally before I pull out of the driveway, plug in the address.
To my parents' house. I know where that is. I still plug it in.
Phone numbers, all of the things that we used to rely on our brains to do, we no longer do. So what's going to happen? We're going to have microevolution around the way that our brain needs to use those energy resources to do, for example, spatial navigation or mapping of an environment. So yes and no. I mean, there are ways that these immersive environments can really change us, but in much more basic ways, the kinds of things we ask our brain to do are the things that are going to dictate who future generations become.
As a developmental neuroscientist with a 9-year-old, what's your take on screen time?
And we limit it, I think, like everybody does. The trick for us right now is we have a 9 and an 11-year-old, so they're transitioning to using the technologies and the screens for school. So we're in that weird moment of not all screen time is bad.
Right.
And so I think it's just a matter of setting up expectations for the kids. Not all screens are bad. And I think there's a time to just, even I like watching TV. There's a time to just relax and unwind. It just can't be all the time.
Dr. Thomason, thank you so much for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks.